Adeline Mercer pressed both palms flat against the altar rail to keep herself from falling, not from nerves. Not from the weight of her gown, but because the man she had just married was walking away from her before the priest had finished speaking. 300 people watched him go. Not one of them moved to stop him. She turned to face the congregation alone, her bouquet crushed in one white-knuckled hand. And she smiled, because she was her father's daughter. And her father had taught her that the moment you let them see you break is the moment they decide you were never worth anything to begin with. If you've ever stood in a room full of people and felt completely alone, stay with this story. Subscribe to our channel and drop your city in the comments below. I want to see exactly how far this story reaches. The morning of her wedding, Adeline Mercer laced her own boots. Rosalind had offered to help. The maid had offered. Even old Mrs. Humphrey, who had been the Mercer household's housekeeper for 22 years and disapproved of sentimentality in all its forms, had appeared in the doorway of the dressing room with her hands folded and her chin up in the particular way that meant she was prepared to be useful if asked. Adeline had thanked all of them and sent them away. She laced her own boots because her hands needed something to do that was not trembling. She was not afraid of the marriage. She had made her peace with the marriage 3 months ago. Sitting beside her father's bed in the last clear week before the end, holding his hand while he told her with the careful, guilty love of a man who knows he is leaving too soon that he had arranged everything. That Nathaniel Caldwell was a good man, a wealthy man. A man who had agreed to take on the Mercer family's debts along with Mercer's eldest daughter. That Adeline and Rosalind would be safe, that he could go knowing that. She had told him it was the right thing. She had meant it. What she was afraid of, lacing her boots in the small dressing room off the side of Hargrove Chapel while carriages ground against the stone drive outside, and 300 guests settled into the pews, was something she couldn't name cleanly, not fear of the unknown. Something more specific. The feeling of walking toward a man and not knowing whether he would see her when she arrived. Rosalind appeared in the doorway. "They're ready for you," she said. Her eyes were red at the rims. She had been crying since before dawn and was apparently going to keep going until someone physically stopped her. "Don't cry at the ceremony," Adeline said, standing and smoothing her skirts. "It'll make people think something is wrong." "Something might be wrong," Rosalind said. "Rosalind, he's never even asked after you. Not once in 8 months. He signed the papers and he sent his solicitor, and he has never once." "Rosalind," Adeline said it the way their mother used to say it. Quiet and final as a door closing. "Hand me the gloves." Rosalind handed them over and pressed her lips together and said nothing else. Adeline drew the gloves on slowly. She looked at herself in the oval mirror. She looked exactly as she had intended to look. Like a woman who had made a decision and intended to honor it. She picked up her bouquet white roses and dried lavender, and she walked out. She noticed it 4 steps past the chapel door. Nathaniel Caldwell was standing at the far end of the aisle with his back to her. Shoulders clasped, not moving, not turning. His dark coat was perfectly pressed, his posture was perfectly controlled. And he was staring straight ahead at the stained glass above the altar, as though Adeline Mercer were simply a sound he had decided not to acknowledge. She kept walking. The whispers started before she'd taken 10 steps. "He hasn't to look. Does he even want—" "Hush. Margaret, for heaven's sake." She kept her chin level. She kept her step even. She counted the pews as she passed them the way she used to count fence posts on the road home from town when she was small and tired and needed something to hold on to. 1, 2, 3. She reached the altar. She stood beside him. And in the 2 seconds before the priest cleared his throat and began, Nathaniel Caldwell turned his head just enough to glance at her, a motion so brief and so mechanical it barely qualified as acknowledgement, and then looked forward again. His expression was empty, not cruel, not reluctant. Simply absent, the way a man looks at something he has filed away under a category that requires no further attention. The priest began to speak. Adeline held her bouquet in both hands, and she breathed, and she did not look at the congregation, and she did not look at her husband, and she looked the middle distance, and she thought, with a clarity that surprised her, he is already somewhere else entirely. He has been somewhere else for a long time, and he has no idea yet that I am standing right here. When Nathaniel was asked to take her hand, he reached over and did so. His fingers closed around hers briefly, correctly, with the same quality of attention a man gives to signing a document he has already read and approved. His hand was large and dry and did not tremble. It released hers before she'd finished registering the contact. She said her vows in a clear, even voice. She was not going to give this room the satisfaction of watching her crack. Not these women with their silk fans and their sidelong calculations. Not these men with their assessing eyes. Not any of them. When the priest pronounced them married, Nathaniel Caldwell turned and walked toward the chapel doors, without waiting for her. She stood at the altar for exactly 3 seconds. Then she pressed her palms to the altar rail, steadied herself, turned to face 300 people with her bouquet in one hand and her spine straight as a fence post. And she smiled, and she walked out after him. The receiving line at Caldwell Manor lasted 1 hour and 47 minutes. Adeline counted. Nathaniel stood 8 inches from her for the entirety of it and spoke to every single guest with what she quickly recognized as a practiced and flawless social competence, remembering names, asking after children, recalling business details with the precision of a man who had been trained from boyhood to manage large rooms of important people. He was, by every external measure, an exemplary host. He did not speak to her once, not to introduce her, not to include her in a conversation, not to place a hand at her back, or turn to her with even the performance of marital warmth. He conducted himself as though the space beside him contained furniture rather than a person. Guests greeted Adeline on their own initiative, and she met all of them with the graciousness her mother had drilled into her from childhood, warm without being effusive, composed without being cold, listening with genuine attention, even when the conversation was merely polite. She was good at this. She had always been good at this. Managing rooms that weren't sure what to make of her was a skill she'd been practicing since she was old enough to understand that being underestimated was only a disadvantage if you let it be. But she felt every one of those 47 minutes in the bones of her feet and the muscles of her jaw and the particular place below her sternum where she kept the things she refused to let reach her face. It was Mrs. Holt who broke through. Mrs. Holt was perhaps 60, with silver-streaked hair, pinned severely, and eyes that had spent 40 years watching rooms, with the patience of a woman who had learned that observing carefully was the only power most women were freely permitted. She took Adeline's hand in both of hers near the end of the line and leaned in very close. "You're doing beautifully," she said, quiet enough that no one else could hear. "Not a single crack. Your mother would be proud." Adeline looked at her. "Did you know my mother?" "I knew of her. Good women in difficult circumstances tend to become known, Mrs." Holt squeezed her hands once hard and released them. "Don't let them see a single crack, my dear. Not tonight. Not ever, if you can help it." She moved on. Adeline stood for a moment with the warmth of that grip still in her palms. Then she turned back to the next guest in line and smiled and said, "How wonderful of you to come." She learned the house in the first week, the way you learn any territory you're going to have to navigate without a guide. Systematically, without sentiment. The ground floor was largely formal reception rooms dressed in heavy furniture. A dining room where the table was long enough to seat 16 and had clearly been doing so for decades. A library with east-facing windows and shelves that ran floor to ceiling. And Nathaniel's study, behind a closed door at the end of the west corridor, which communicated its own message so clearly that no one needed to say it aloud. Upstairs, family bedrooms, each one larger and better appointed than anything in the Mercer house. And at the far end of the corridor, separated from the other rooms by an unusual stretch of empty hallway. A door locked. She noticed it the second day. On the third morning she was passing with a candle. The house was enormous, and still unfamiliar in the dark, and she stopped and looked at it. Plain wood, no different from the others in the corridor, except for the quality of the silence behind it, which was thicker somehow, more deliberate. She raised her hand and knocked. Lightly, not expecting an answer. No answer came. She lowered her hand and walked on. But she noted it. A woman who had managed a struggling estate for 2 years, while her father declined, knew the difference between a room that was locked because it was empty and a room that was locked because someone needed it to stay exactly the way it was. This was the second kind. Supper was its own particular education. They sat at opposite ends of the 16-person table each evening. This was not discussed or negotiated. It was simply the arrangement that appeared on the first night and continued unchanged. The servants moved between them with the precision of a choreography that had been practiced for years before Adeline arrived, and required no adjustment for her presence. Nathaniel ate. He occasionally reviewed correspondence that a footman brought to his elbow. Once, on the fourth evening, he read a letter twice, set it down, pressed 2 fingers to the bridge of his nose for a moment, then folded it and put it in his coat pocket and picked up his fork again. His face throughout this sequence communicated nothing legible. On the 5th evening, Adeline said, "The east fence along Miller's Creek is down in 2 places. I saw it this morning from the road." He looked up. It was the first time he had looked at her directly across the table. The look lasted perhaps 4 seconds. "I'll have it seen to," he said. "The cattle in the lower pasture have been drifting," she said. "If the fence isn't repaired before the weekend, you'll lose at least 6 head into Pruitt's fields." A pause. "You've been inspecting the property." "I've been walking," she said. "I notice things when I walk." He looked at her for another 3 seconds. Then he set down his fork and said to the footman, "Send word to Haynes tonight. East fence, Miller's Creek. 2 breaks. Have it repaired by Friday." The footman nodded and disappeared. Nathaniel picked up his fork again. He did not look at her again that evening. But she had the distinct sensation, quiet, careful. Not yet anything she would stake a claim on. The quality of his not looking had changed. That he was now choosing not to look at her, which was different from simply failing to register that she was there. That was something. Small, but something. She found the letters on a Tuesday afternoon. She had not been looking for them. She had been on the second shelf, from the left of the library's east wall, working through the estate ledgers with the methodical patience of a woman who understood that knowing a place's financial history was the fastest way to understand what the people living in it actually valued. She reached past a row of ledgers for the volume she wanted, and her fingers found instead a slim bundle of papers bound with a piece of pale green ribbon, tucked behind the row as though shelved hastily. She pulled it out. Letters, bound together. The handwriting on the top envelope was a woman's, small and slightly backward slanting. The kind of script taught to girls of a certain class in a certain era. The envelope was addressed to N, just that one initial. Adeline turned the bundle over in her hands. Then she set it on the shelf beside her, exactly where she'd found it, and continued looking for her ledger. She was not going to learn her husband through his secrets. If she was going to learn him, it would be through watching. Through the way he moved through his own house. Through the things he chose to say and the things he chose not to. Through the particular quality of his silences, which she was beginning to understand were not all that some of them were blank, and some of them were full, and some of them were the specific silence of a man holding something at arm's length with considerable effort. She had time. She was going to be here a long time. She found her ledger and took it to the window seat and opened it and began to read. The information about Clara Whitlock arrived on a Wednesday, in the dry goods store, delivered by Mrs. Pruitt around. Warm, irrepressible woman who had clearly been waiting for an occasion to share it. "Oh, you must be the new Mrs. Caldwell." She leaned across the counter with her elbows planted and her voice already lowered to the register of a woman who was about to say something important. "I did wonder when I heard what?" Adeline said, examining a spool of brown thread. "Well, about the, I mean." Given his history, Mrs. Pruitt paused, retreated slightly. "Of course I don't like to speak out of turn. Of course not. It's only another pause." Then, as though the words had been waiting behind a dam that had just given way. "Miss Clara Whitlock. You've heard the name?" Adeline set down the thread spool. "I haven't." Mrs. Pruitt's eyes widened. The particular brightness in them was the brightness of a woman who has just realized she is the first to arrive at a destination everyone else is heading toward. "Oh, my dear. Well, she and Mr. Caldwell were engaged. This was 5, 6 years back now. Beautiful girl. Daughter of the Whitlock family up near the ridge. Lovely people." She stopped. Her expression shifted into something more genuinely sorrowful. "They were out riding. The bridge over Miller's Creek, the old one. Before they rebuilt it gave way in the spring flood. He made it to the bank." She paused. She didn't. Adeline was quiet for a moment. "He pulled her out?" she asked. "He tried." Mrs. Pruitt's voice had gone soft. "They say he was in the water for 20 minutes trying. The current was something terrible that spring. He got to shore finally and she was already gone downstream." She shook her head. "He's never been says so. Just shut down. Like something in him closed and he locked it from the inside." Adeline looked at the shelf in front of her without seeing it. The bridge over Miller's Creek. She thought about the east fence, the cattle drifting, the 2 breaks she had mentioned at supper, and the way he had gone very still for just half a second before he told the footman to send word to Haynes. East fence, Miller's Creek. He hadn't reacted to the name. His face had shown nothing, but she wondered now. At the cost of that nothing, she bought her thread and her mending wool, thanked Mrs. Pruitt, and walked back to the manor in the clear afternoon light. The valley spread out below her in every direction, wide and green and old, full of the specific silence of land that has absorbed a great deal of human living and continued regardless. She walked and she thought. He was not cold because he was indifferent. He was cold because he was guilty, because he had survived something he believed he should not have survived. And he had decided, not consciously maybe, but in the particular deep way that real decisions get made, that he did not deserve to be warm again. The locked room. The turned-down portrait she had glimpsed once through a doorway she hadn't been certain what she'd seen. But she was certain now. The letters behind the ledgers. One initial N. She stopped walking for a moment. She stood in the lane with her parcel under her arm, and the October light falling long across the fields, and she recalibrated. Not with softness, she was not in the business of excusing behavior that had caused her real pain. But with accuracy, because responding accurately to a situation was the only way to respond to it usefully. And she had a very long time to be useful in this marriage, if she chose to be. He was not a cruel man. He was a broken man who had constructed a very convincing imitation of a contained one. And she was going to have to decide what she intended to do about that. She decided at supper. She waited until the first course was cleared, and the footman stepped back. And then she said, "I heard something in the village today that I think you'd want to know." "I know." He looked up. But fast. "Concerning what?" he said. "Miss Clara Whitlock," she said. The stillness that came over him was different from his ordinary stillness. This one had weight to it. The kind of weight that comes from a thing pressing outward against a structure that has been holding it for a very long time. "Who 'twasn't a question. It doesn't matter," she said. "I'm not bringing it up to cause you discomfort. I'm bringing it up because I'd rather we were honest with each other about where we actually stand than continue performing a version of this marriage that neither of us believes." A long silence. "And where," he said, very carefully, "do you believe we stand?" She looked at him down the length of the table. "Two people who are strangers," she said, "who are going to have to find a way to share a house and a life without damaging each other past the point of repair. I'm not asking you to love me, Mr. Caldwell. I'm not asking you to feel anything you don't feel. I'm asking you to treat me like a person who is actually in the room." The silence after that lasted long enough that she heard the candles on the sideboard give a soft, collective flicker in a draft from somewhere. Then Nathaniel said, "That is a very pragmatic accounting of a marriage." "Yes," she said. "I suppose it is." He looked at her. The look lasted longer than any look he had given her since the ceremony not long. Not warm, not anything she would call a concession. But it was a look that registered her, that acknowledged she was a specific person sitting at a specific end of a specific table, and not simply a general domestic presence to be managed. He rose at the end of the meal and paused just briefly behind his chair. "The east shelves in the library," he said, without looking at her. "The estate records there are more complete than what Hargrove's office gave you. If you intend to keep walking the property and noticing things, sees." He left. Adeline sat for a moment in the candlelit quiet of the enormous dining room. "If you intend to keep walking the property and noticing things." Not warmth, not even courtesy quite, but information offered voluntarily, without prompting, addressed to her, specifically to the version of her that had walked the fence line and observed the cattle, and brought a practical problem to his table, and asked for nothing except that it be addressed. He had seen that. He had seen that, and he had responded to it. And that was more than he had done in 3 weeks of marriage. She blew out her candle. She went to bed. She was in the library the next morning before the household was properly awake, cross-legged on the floor with the east shelf ledgers spread in a circle around her and her notebook open across her knee. She had been there 2 hours when the library door opened and Nathaniel stopped in the doorway. He looked at her. She looked up. "You actually read them," he said. "You told me they were complete," she said. "They are. Your grandfather organized by quarter and parcel, which is sensible. Your father switched systems in 1802 and never fully transitioned. Which is why the mill records from that period look contradictory. They're not. They're just in 2 different formats running simultaneously." She held out her notebook. "I've flagged the pages. There's also a tenant lease in the South Holdings that appears to have a built-in inequity compounding annually. I'd like to understand whether that was intentional." Nathaniel was quiet for a long moment. Then he came in. He did not sit on the floor. That appeared to be a line he was not yet prepared to cross. He took the chair across from her and reached for the ledger she extended and found the flagged page. And for the next 2 hours he explained the mill system, the tenant lease, the drought year that had upended 3 years of careful planning, and the renegotiations that followed. He spoke to the ledger, mostly, to the middle distance, occasionally to a point somewhere slightly left of her face. But he answered every question, and only once. But she noted it carefully when she raised a point about the compounding inequity in the South lease and suggested it might warrant revisiting. He was quiet for a moment and then said, "I hadn't looked at it that way. It might be worth looking at now," she said. "Perhaps," he said. He left with the flagged ledger under his arm. She sat on the floor of the library and looked at the space where he had been sitting, and she allowed herself to feel, carefully and with full awareness of its smallness, the thing she had been keeping at arm's length for 3 weeks. Not hope. Hope was too large and too fragile for this moment. Something more survivable than hope. The recognition that the man inside the walls was not the walls. That somewhere inside Nathaniel Caldwell's elaborate and meticulous self-containment was a person who had looked at a drought year accounting discrepancy through a new set of eyes, and, with what appeared to be genuine honesty, admitted he hadn't seen it that way before. It was not enough, but it was true, and true was something she could build on. That evening at supper, Nathaniel arrived before her. She entered the dining room, and he was already seated. And he looked up when she came in immediately, without delay, and then he looked back down at his place setting. But he had looked up, not the mechanical glance of obligation. Something closer to a reflex. She took her seat. The soup arrived. They ate in silence. Halfway through the second course, She heard him set down his spoon and say, "The South lease. The tenant family has been there since my grandfather's time." She looked up. He was examining his wineglass. "I know," she said. "I found their name in the original parcel records. 31 years. The compounding rate was an error," he said. "In the original drafting. My father chose not to correct it." He paused. "I have also chosen not to correct it until now." She looked at him. He did not look at her. "I'll have Hargrove draft a corrected agreement," he said. "Before winter." She said, "That's the right thing to do." He picked up his spoon. Outside, the wind moved through the valley with a low sound like a long exhale, like something that had been held a very long time was finally, slowly beginning to let go. Adeline ate her supper. She kept her face calm and her hands steady, and she did not let herself feel the full weight of what was shifting in this house. Because the full weight of it was still too uncertain, and she was a practical woman who had learned young that you do not pour your whole self into something until you are certain the ground beneath it will hold. But she was still here. She had walked down that aisle invisible, and she had spent 3 weeks learning the architecture of a man who had sealed every door against the world. And she was still here, still watching, still building. Carefully and without sentimentality, from every small true thing he allowed into the space between them. And at the far end of the table, Nathaniel Caldwell set down his spoon and was quiet for a moment. Then he said, without looking up, without any particular inflection, as though it were a simple and unremarkable observation, "You walk the east pasture on Tuesday mornings." She went still. "I've noticed," he said. He picked up his fork. He did not look at her. But the locked room at the end of the corridor, the one no one had entered in years, the one that held whatever he was preserving against the passage of time seemed, in that moment, to be just slightly less sealed than it had been before. Just slightly. And down the hall out of sight, a door that had been shut for a very long time gave the smallest, almost imperceptible sound. Not opening, not yet. But something had touched the latch. And somewhere on the other side, moving silently through Virginia's social world, with a smile that had been sharpened over years into something that could pass for genuine, a woman named Vivienne Hartwell had just accepted an invitation to the Caldwell Autumn Ball. She had accepted it the moment she heard a new wife had moved into that house. She had been waiting for exactly this kind of opening. And she was very, very good at walking through doors that other people had left unguarded. November came in hard that year. Adeline felt it in the mornings first, the way the floorboards held the cold differently, the way her breath showed in the corridor before the fires were lit. She had taken to rising early, earlier than the household, earlier than the servants, who stoked the grates and set the kitchen going. She did it partly because she had always been an early riser, and partly because the house, in those first gray hours before anyone else was moving, felt more honestly itself than it did at any other time of day. She walked the east pasture on Tuesday mornings. He had noticed. She had not stopped thinking about that. Not because it was romantic, it wasn't. Not yet, not close, but because it meant he was watching. And a man who is watching is a man who has not entirely closed himself off, whatever the architecture of walls he has built suggests. You cannot observe someone carefully and remain completely indifferent to them. Indifference does not pay attention. Indifference does not track the pattern of a woman's Tuesday walks and then mention it across a supper table with the particular care of a man who wanted to say something true without saying anything that could be taken back. She was thinking about this on a Wednesday morning, sitting at the small writing desk in her room with her notebook open and the estate map spread beside it, when Bessie knocked and entered with the breakfast tray and said, without meeting her eyes, "Mr. Caldwell's compliments." "Ma'am. He asks if you'd be willing to ride out with him this morning to look at the South holdings." Adeline looked up from the map. Bessie was very carefully examining the tray. "Did he say why?" Adeline asked. "Something about the lease, ma'am. He said you'd understand." She understood. She was ready in 20 minutes. They rode out side by side in the early morning cold, and Nathaniel did not speak for the first mile and a half. This did not trouble her. She had learned by now the difference between his silences. And this one was the working kind, the kind that meant he was organizing something internally before committing it to words. The South Holdings were 3 miles from the manor house, across a rise of land that looked out over the valley in every direction. The tenant property sat at the base of the rise, a well-kept farm, with a barn that listed slightly east and a kitchen garden that had been put to bed for the winter. The beds covered in straw and burlap. A man came out of the barn when he heard the horses. He was perhaps 55, broad across the shoulders, with the particular deliberateness of movement that belongs to people who have done hard physical work for most of their lives. He stopped when he saw who had come. Then he pulled off his hat. "Mr. Caldwell," he said. "Sir Haynes," Nathaniel said. He dismounted, and Adeline dismounted beside him, and he said, "This is Mrs. Caldwell." Haynes looked at her directly. Not with calculation, not with the assessing quality she had grown accustomed to in the social rooms of Virginia. Just direct, honest attention. "Ma'am," he said, and dipped his head. "Welcome. Thank you," she said. "How long has your family been on this property?" "Mr. Haynes?" He blinked, a quick surprised blink, the kind that means no one has asked that question before. Or at least not recently. 32 years this spring. "Ma'am, my father came first. I came when I was 23, she nodded. "And your children?" "2 sons, ma'am, both working the land with me." He glanced at Nathaniel, not suspiciously, but checking something. Then back to her. "It's good land." "We've kept it well, I can see that," she said. Nathaniel said, "I've asked Hargrove to draft a corrected lease. The compounding rate was an error in the original document. You'll see the difference beginning in January." Haynes went very still. "Sir," he said carefully, It's always been wrong," Nathaniel said. "It should have been corrected years ago." A long beat of silence. Haynes looked at his hat in his hands, his jaw moved once. Then he looked up and said, "I don't know what to say." "Sir, you don't need to say anything," Nathaniel told him. "Hargrove will be in touch before Christmas." They rode back toward the manor, and the silence between them on the return was different from the silence on the way out. Fuller, less empty. After nearly a mile, Nathaniel said, "He's been overpaying by roughly 14% annually for 11 years. "I know," Adeline said. "I calculated it." He glanced at her sideways. "You calculated it. I told you I notice things when I walk." She kept her eyes on the road ahead. "And when I read. And when I do arithmetic." Another silence. Then very quietly, almost to himself, "My father knew. He chose not to correct it because the additional income suited a particular period of expenditure." She said nothing. "She waited, I knew also," he said. "For 3 years." She turned her head and looked at him. He was looking at the road. "And now you're correcting it," she said. "Yes. Because it's the right thing to do," he said. "Because someone pointed out that it was wrong in a way that made it impossible to continue pretending I hadn't noticed." She turned back to the road. Something moved in her chest, not softness, not yet, but the specific warmth of being seen accurately, of having done something that mattered and having it registered. "You're welcome," she said. He made a sound that was not quite a laugh. It was brief and quickly controlled, but it was there. She heard it clearly. She did not look at him, but she felt the corners of her own mouth move. Just slightly, and she let them. The weeks that followed moved differently. Not warmly, she would not call it warm, but differently. The 8 inches of space between them at the receiving line had closed to something less formal, less deliberately maintained. He began arriving at supper before she did, and rising when she entered. She did not remark on it. He began including her when the estate manager came with reports, not formally, not by announcement, simply by not sending her away when the meetings happened to find her in the library. She sat and listened and occasionally asked questions. And after the third time, the estate manager had stopped being surprised by her presence and begun directing some of his answers toward her, as naturally as toward Nathaniel. She found one morning that the ledger she had flagged was back on the east shelf. Not hidden behind the row this time. Set properly. Spine out, in its correct sequence, he had returned it. She ran her finger along the spine. Small things. She was building from small things. The way you build a fire from tinder before you add the log. The tinder has to catch first. You can't rush it. You can only keep the conditions right and be patient and watch for the moment when something that was barely a spark becomes something that will actually hold. She was watching. And then on a Thursday evening in late November, the locked door at the end of the corridor opened. She heard it. She was in her room, reading by the fire, and she heard the sound of a key in a lock, the particular sound, slightly effortful, of a mechanism that hadn't been used in a long time. Then the slow movement of a door. She did not move from her chair. She heard footsteps go in, heard nothing for a long time, long enough that she had read 3 more pages and absorbed none of them. Then footsteps again, and the door closing, and the key turning back. She did not go into the corridor. She went to bed. But she lay in the dark for a long time after, listening to the house breathe around her. And she thought about a man who had kept a room locked for 5 years and had opened it tonight. And she thought about what it cost to do a thing like that. And she did not let herself feel too much about it, because feeling too much too soon was its own kind of recklessness. She slept eventually. In the morning she came down to breakfast, and Nathaniel was already there, which was unusual. He was almost never there at breakfast, and he was standing at the window with a cup of coffee, looking out. He turned when she came in. "There's something I'd like to show you," he said. "If you're willing." She looked at him. His face was controlled, as it always was, but there was something in it she hadn't seen before. Something effortful, like a man carrying something heavy and choosing, deliberately, to carry it upright. "All right," she said. He led her upstairs. He led her to the end of the corridor. He unlocked the door. The room had been a sitting room once, or something like it. The furniture suggested comfort, a particular kind of private ease. But Adeline barely registered the furniture. What she registered was the portrait above the mantelpiece. A young woman, perhaps 22 or 23, with light brown hair and a direct, lively expression that seemed to push slightly against the formality of the pose. She was pretty in the way of people who are genuinely engaged with the world around them. And the painter had caught something of that, a quality of life in the eyes that made the portrait feel less like a document and more like a presence. Nathaniel stood beside Adeline and looked at the portrait and said nothing for a long moment. Then he said her name was Clara Whitlock. We were engaged for 14 months. She died in the spring flood of 1857 on the bridge over Miller's Creek. He paused. I was with her. I did not bring her out, Adeline said. I know you know, he said. I want you to hear me say it. She turned her head and looked at him. His face was very still. The effortful quality was more pronounced now, the quality of a man doing something that cost him and doing it anyway, because he has decided it needs to be done. I closed this room because I could not be in it, he said. And I could not remove what was in it. Both things were true at the same time, and I saw no resolution. So I locked the door. He stopped. I have been locking doors for 5 years. Most of them are not made of wood. Adeline looked back at the portrait. She looks, she said carefully, like someone who would have disliked being locked away. A long silence. Yes, he said. She would have hated it. Then perhaps it's time to let her be somewhere else. Not erased, just not locked. He said nothing for a moment. Then that is a very particular way of thinking about grief. My mother died when I was 15, Adeline said. My father spent 2 years after that, treating everything she had ever touched like a shrine. He couldn't move a chair without it becoming a decision about whether he still loved her. She paused. Eventually, I told him that she hadn't loved the chair. She'd loved him, and she would have wanted the chair moved if moving it made the room more useful to the people still living in it. Nathaniel turned and looked at her. A full look, the kind he almost never gave her, direct and extended and registering her completely. "How old were you when you said that to him?" he asked. 17, Lord, he said quietly. It was barely a word. Almost just a breath, but it was the most unguarded thing she had heard him say. She did not make anything of it. She turned back to the portrait and let the moment settle without pressing it. The way you let a frightened animal come forward without reaching. "You don't have to decide anything today," she said. "I just wanted you to know that what's in this room doesn't frighten me. And it doesn't have to stay locked on my account," he said. After a long pause, "Thank you, Mrs. Caldwell." She almost said Adeline. She held it back, too soon, everything in its right time. "Of course," she said instead. She walked back down the corridor to her room. And she sat at her writing desk and opened her notebook and did not write anything in it for a long time. December brought the announcement of the Caldwell Autumn Ball. Adeline heard about it from the housekeeper, Mrs. Greer, a tall, spare woman of impeccable competence who had managed the manor's domestic operations for 14 years and had accepted Adeline's presence with the careful neutrality of someone who had learned not to form attachments to anything that might be removed. "The invitations go out on the 15th, ma'am," Mrs. Greer said. "Mr. Caldwell usually manages the guest list himself, but he's asked whether you'd like to review it." Adeline looked up from the menu she'd been revising. He asked. "This morning, ma'am. He said to tell you the list was on his desk if you wanted to look it over." She went to his study. He wasn't there, he was out with the estate manager, but the list was on the desk. As promised, weighted down by a brass paperweight in the shape of a horse. She picked it up and read through it. 46 names. Local family, county officials, a judge from the circuit court, 2 state assemblymen, the usual architecture of a man who entertained out of obligation rather than pleasure. And near the bottom, in Nathaniel's handwriting, added after the typed list had been prepared, Hartwell v. She stared at that name for a moment. She didn't know it. She set the list back under the paperweight and went to find Mrs. Greer. "Vivian Hartwell," she said. "Who is she, Mrs.?" Greer's expression did not change, but something in it consolidated slightly, the particular quality of us arranging their face with more care than the question should strictly require. "She was a friend of Miss Whitlock's, ma'am, Mrs. Greer said. "They grew up together," Adeline said. "And she and Mr. Caldwell, they have remained acquainted, Mrs. Greer said. Precisely, carefully, in the way of a woman who is telling the truth while conveying, without saying aloud, that the truth has more texture than the words suggest." "I see," Adeline said. "Thank you, Mrs. Greer." She went back to her menu and she sat with that name for a while. Vivian Hartwell, close friend of Clara's, remained acquainted with Nathaniel. She noted it, she filed it. She did not allow herself to feel threatened by it. Because feeling threatened by something you don't yet understand is a waste of the energy you'll need when you understand it better. But she noted it. That evening at supper she said, "I looked at the guest list. Any objections?" he said. "No objections," she said. He looked at her. "Waiting. Vivian Hartwell," she said. "Tell me about her." Something moved through his expression, quick, controlled, almost invisible. Almost. "She was Clara's closest friend," he said. "They were inseparable growing up. After Clara died, Vivian grieved considerably. She and I have maintained a cordial acquaintance since. She's part of this county's social fabric. It would have been strange not to include her." Adeline looked at him steadily. "Has she been to the manor since you married?" "No." A brief pause. "Once. A note of congratulation." Another pause. "I did." She picked up her wine glass. "I only ask," she said, "because I prefer to know the landscape before I walk into it. I don't intend to make anything difficult. I simply like to know what I'm walking into." He looked at her with that direct, extended look she was beginning to recognize as his version of genuine engagement. "She is not a threat to this marriage, Mrs. Caldwell." She met his eyes. "I didn't say she was." "No," he said, "but you were thinking it." She set down her glass. "I was thinking that she was Clara's closest friend, that she has remained close to you, that she sent a congratulatory note," you answered, "and that she will be in this house in 3 weeks, surrounded by every important person in this county. I was thinking that I would like to know, before that happens, whether there is anything else I should understand." He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "After Clara died, Vivienne was kind to me, in the way that people who share a grief are sometimes kind to each other. There was a period of perhaps 6 months where we spent time together regularly. I was not," he stopped. "I was not in a condition to recognize at the time that her interest in that proximity was not entirely mutual." Adeline said carefully, "She was in love with you." "I believe so. I did not return it. I made that clear eventually, though not as early as I should have." He looked at the table. "She accepted it with grace. Publicly and privately he said nothing." "Mr. Caldwell, I have never had evidence of anything beyond private disappointment," he said, "which is a human thing and not something I would hold against her." Adeline looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, all right," he repeated. "You've told me what I needed to know," she said. "I appreciate it." She picked up her fork. "The ball menu. Mrs. Greer has proposed a cold buffet for the late supper. I think it should be hot. Do you have a preference?" He stared at her for a moment. Then he said, with something that was not quite but almost resembled faint amusement, "Hot. Good," she said. "That's what I thought." The 2 weeks before the ball were the fullest 2 weeks Adeline had spent in Caldwell Manor. She worked with Mrs. Greer on the supper menu and the table arrangements. She revised the receiving room layout. She ordered additional candles from the chandler in town. She wrote 7 response notes to acceptances that had arrived without acknowledgement from the Manor correspondence that should have been managed weeks earlier and hadn't been, because until now there had been no one in the house with the inclination to manage it. Nathaniel watched all of this with the particular quality of a man who does not know quite how to respond to having his household efficiently organized by someone he had been treating for most of 3 months as a politely endured inconvenience. He said very little about it, but he stopped disappearing after supper. He began sitting in the library in the evenings, reading, in the chair across from the one she had started to use as her own. They did not always talk, but they were in the same room. And the same room felt different now, less like a space she was permitted to use, and more like a space they both inhabited. One evening he set down his book and said, out of nowhere, "You said your mother died when you were 15. She looked up from her letter. "Yes. And your father was ill for how long before he died?" 2 years, she said. "He was himself for most of it. The last 3 months were different. And you managed the household throughout." "Rosalind was 17, she said. "Someone had to." He looked at her steadily. "You were 17 when you told him to move the chair," he said. "You were running the household at 17. And then you agreed to this marriage because he asked you to. Because it was the right thing," she said. "For Rosalind. For the family. Did you want it?" The question landed with more weight than she suspected he intended. She was quiet for a moment. "I wanted my father to die without being afraid," she said. "I wanted Rosalind to be safe. I wanted there to be a version of the future in which the people I loved were all right." She looked at him. "I don't think wanting a marriage for its own sake was a luxury I had time to consider," he said. "That is one of the most honest things anyone has ever said to me." "I find honesty more useful than the alternative," she said. "It saves a great deal of time." A silence. "You must have been very angry with him when he arranged it." She considered the question seriously, which was the only way she knew how to consider things. "I was frightened," she said finally. "Not of the marriage itself. Of walking into something I didn't understand with someone who hadn't chosen to know me." She paused. I thought the worst version was that you would be cruel. When you weren't, when you were simply absent, I had to recalibrate. Absent, he said. That is a precise word for it. It's the accurate word. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, I owe you an apology. She looked at him. For the first weeks, he said. For the ceremony. He stopped. Tried again. I had agreed to this marriage because it was practical and because it was time, and because I had told myself for 5 years that I was ready and discovered on the day itself that I was not. He met her eyes. That was not your fault. It was not your failure. And the way I conducted myself made it appear as though it were both. She held his gaze. Yes, she said. It did, I'm sorry, he said. It was simply said. No elaboration, no qualification, no retreating from it. Just those 2 words, set down on the space between them, like something placed carefully and left there. She said thank you. And then, because she was Adeline Mercer, and she did not collapse sentiment into drama when plain language would do. Now let's talk about the ball. The East drawing room I wanted opened. Mrs. Greer says it hasn't been used in 4 years, but the proportions are better for dancing than the main hall. He blinked. Then he said, You want to open the East drawing room? For the dancing? Yes. The main hall will be too crowded once all 46 guests are in it. A pause. That room hasn't been used since before Clara died, she said. Not harshly, just accurately, I know. I think it should be used now. I think you should have a house full of people dancing in a room you've kept closed. And I think it should feel like a house that is living again, rather than one that is waiting for something to change. She looked at him steadily. But it's your house. Tell me if you'd rather not. He was quiet for a long moment. Open the East drawing room, he said. She nodded. I'll tell Mrs. Greer. She went back to her letter. He sat across from her in the quiet library, with his book unopened in his lap. And he was very still. And she did not look up to see his expression, because some moments are private, even when you are sitting 2 feet from someone. But she heard him exhale, slow and deliberate, like a man setting something down that he had been carrying for a very long time. She kept writing, and in the spare bedroom on the 2nd floor of the Hartwell house, 12 miles across the valley, Vivian Hartwell stood at her writing desk and read the formal invitation to the Caldwell Autumn Ball for the 3rd time. She traced the return address with one finger. Mrs. Nathaniel Caldwell. She had heard things in the weeks since the marriage. Small things. The kind of things that travel through a county on the current of social interaction. A word here. An observation there. That the new Mrs. Caldwell was unexpectedly capable. That she walked the property and read the ledgers and had the estate manager directing answers to her as naturally as to Nathaniel. That the East drawing room, closed for years, was being opened for the ball. Vivian set the invitation down. She had loved Nathaniel Caldwell for 6 years. She had loved him before Clara, though she had never said so. She had loved him through Clara, and she had carried that quietly because Clara was her closest friend, and some things you carry in silence, or you lose everything. She had loved him after, in those terrible grief-soaked months, when they were simply 2 people wrecked by the same loss. Sitting in the same wreckage together, she had thought, in those months, that something might shift, that proximity and shared grief might become something else. It hadn't. He had been kind, he had been clear, and she had accepted it. Publicly, with every grace she possessed, but she had not stopped. And now there was a woman in that house, a woman who was opening rooms that had been closed. A woman who had, by all accounts, found her way into the margins of Nathaniel Caldwell's carefully defended life in 3 months, when Vivian had not managed it in 6 years. She picked up her pen. She wrote her acceptance. She wrote it warmly and correctly and without a single word out of place. And she told herself, as she sealed it, that she was simply attending a ball. That she was simply maintaining a long-standing social connection. That she had no intention of causing difficulty. She told herself all of this. She was not entirely sure she believed it. The ball was 12 days away. And inside Caldwell Manor, in the east drawing room that smelled of old air and memory, and the particular silence of a space that had been waiting for longer than was comfortable, Adeline Mercer stood in the center of the floor and looked at the space around her, and thought about what it would take to fill it with something warm and alive. She thought she knew. She thought she was getting there. She just needed a little more time. The morning of the ball, Adeline woke before dawn and lay still in the dark for a long moment, listening to the house. It was different already. She could feel it, the particular tension of a place that knows something is coming. Footsteps earlier than usual in the corridor below. The distant sound of Mrs. Greer's voice directing the kitchen staff with her characteristic precision. The smell of beeswax and wood smoke drifting up from the east drawing room where 3 maids had been working since yesterday afternoon. She had done what she set out to do. The room was open. The house was breathing. She rose and dressed herself. She had never required a maid for that. And she wasn't going to start now, and she went downstairs before breakfast to walk through the east drawing room one final time. She pushed open the door and stepped in. The room had transformed. She stood in the center of it and turned slowly, and she let herself feel. For just one private moment before the day claimed her. The satisfaction of a thing done well. Candles in every sky. The floor cleared and polished. The furniture arranged to open the space rather than fill it. It looked like a room that had decided to be alive again. She heard a step behind her. She turned. Nathaniel stood in the doorway. He was already dressed, which surprised her. He was rarely up this early. He looked at the room with an expression she couldn't fully read. But what she could read was the quality of the effort it was costing him to stand there and look at it without flinching. He looked at it for a long time. Then he said, "It looks the way it used to look." "Is that all right?" she asked. A pause. "Yes," he said, "it's more than all right." He looked at her. "Thank you, Adeline." It was the first time he had used her given name. She felt it land, felt the specific warmth of it in her chest, and she did not make anything visible of it. She simply said, "You're welcome, Nathaniel," and watched something in his face shift slightly at the sound of his own name in her voice. "Breakfast," he said after a moment. "Breakfast," she agreed. They walked to the dining room together, and for the first time in 4 months, the distance between them on the walk was the distance of 2 people who have decided, without announcement, that the space between them no longer needs to be maintained quite so carefully. The guests began arriving at 6. Adeline stood beside Nathaniel in the entrance hall, and she greeted every single person who came through that door with the warmth and precision of a woman who had been watching how this county worked for 4 months and had learned its particular grammar. She remembered names. She connected faces to the details she had filed away from estate records and supper conversations and Mrs. Greer's careful briefings. She asked after the right children. She remembered the right business matters. She made people feel, from the moment they crossed the threshold, that this was a house that knew them. She felt Nathaniel watching her do it. Not constantly, but repeatedly. The way a person keeps returning to something that continues to surprise them. By 8 o'clock the house was full, and the east drawing room had found its music. A quartet had been brought in from Charlottesville. Adeline's arrangement, over the mild protest of Mrs. Greer, who had suggested a pianist, and the sound of it moved through the manor the way she had hoped. Warm and alive, reaching into rooms that had been quiet for years. She was speaking to Judge Alcott and his wife near the fireplace when she first felt it. The particular prickling awareness that comes when a room shifts around you, when something enters that changes the quality of the air. She looked toward the doorway. Vivian Hartwell stood at the entrance to the drawing room. She was 31, exactly as Adeline had somehow known she would be tall. Dark-haired, dressed in deep green that suited her, with the confidence of a woman who understood precisely what she was doing. She looked like someone who had been welcome in this room for a very long time. She looked at the room with the ease of a person returning to a place they consider partly their own. And then she looked at Adeline. The look lasted only a moment. It was perfectly pleasant. The smile that followed was perfectly gracious. Adeline held it without blinking and smiled back with equal grace. Judge Alcott was saying something about the spring circuit. She returned her attention to him completely and did not look at Vivian Hartwell again. But she tracked her, the way you track a weather system you have decided to take seriously. The first hour passed smoothly enough. Vivian moved through the room with practiced ease, greeting people she had known for years, receiving embraces and exclamations with the warmth of a woman who was deeply embedded in this community's social fabric. She was genuinely liked, Adeline observed, not just tolerated. Genuinely liked, and that was information worth having. It meant that anything Vivian chose to do in this room tonight, she would do with the credibility of a person the room already trusted. Adeline kept that in mind. Nathaniel crossed the room to greet Vivian at approximately 8:40. Adeline watched it happen from 20 feet away, while maintaining a conversation with the wife of one of the assemblymen about the particular challenges of a Virginia winter. She watched Nathaniel extend his hand, watched Vivian take it with both of hers a fraction longer than a simple handshake. Not long enough to be remarkable to anyone not paying close attention. Watched them exchange a few words, Vivian's head tilting slightly, Nathaniel's expression remaining in its controlled register. Watched Vivian look across the room to where Adeline was standing. The look was brief, assessing, then back to Nathaniel. Adeline smiled at Mrs. Pemberton and asked a follow-up question about the winter wool market. She was not going to perform anxiety she had decided not to feel. The dancing started at 9. Nathaniel found her at 5 past and said, with the slight formality of a man doing something that matters to him but that he wants to look casual about, "Will you dance with me? I thought you didn't dance." "I don't," he said. "Particularly. But I'd like to open the floor with my wife in the East drawing room, if she's willing." She took his hand. They walked to the floor together. And she felt the room shift around them, that particular quality of attention that a crowd gives to something it has been waiting for, without knowing it was waiting. Nathaniel placed his hand at her waist with the careful deliberateness of a man who understood the significance of the gesture and was making it anyway. And she put her hand on his shoulder, and the music started. And they danced. He was not a graceful dancer. He had told the truth about that. He was measured and correct and slightly stiff, and he moved through the steps with the concentration and working from memory rather than feeling. But he was there, he was present. He did not look over her shoulder or manage his expression into remoteness. He looked at her steadily, directly, with the look she had come to recognize as his version of being fully present. "You're counting," she said. "I told you I don't dance well. You're doing fine. I'm doing adequately. For a man who told me he doesn't dance, adequately is fine." Something shifted in his expression, that brief, almost invisible softening she had learned to read. "You're very easy to be honest with," he said. "I'm not sure whether that's a quality you were born with or one you developed." "Probably both," she said. "My father was constitutionally incapable of pretense. I seem to have inherited it." They made one full circuit of the floor. When the dance ended and they stepped apart, the room gave a small, collective sound, not applause exactly, something warmer than that. The sound of people who have witnessed something they weren't certain they'd see. Adeline squeezed his hand once before releasing it. He looked at her hand, then at her face. Then he went to speak to the assemblyman. Because he was a man who ran a large estate, and these things required maintenance. And she watched him go with the quiet knowledge that something had shifted tonight that could not be unshifted. She turned back toward the room. Vivian Hartwell was standing 6 feet away. And she was smiling at Adeline with a warmth that did not reach anything behind her eyes. "Mrs. Caldwell," Vivian said, "what a remarkable job you've done with the manor." I barely recognize the East drawing room. Thank you, Adeline said. It's a wonderful room. I'm glad it's being used. It has been so long. Vivian's smile held perfectly. I used to spend a great deal of time in this room. Years ago, Claire and I both did. She paused, precisely calibrated. I suppose Nathaniel told you about Clara. He did, Adeline said. It must have been strange. Hearing about the woman who came before you. Not strange, Adeline said. Informative. She sounds like she was a remarkable person. Something flickered in Vivian's expression. Just for a moment. Then the smile resettled. She was extraordinary. Nathaniel was devastated when she died. Truly devastated. I was with him through most of that first year. She looked across the room toward him. We were very close in that period. I know, Adeline said pleasantly. He told me. A fractional pause. He told you. We talk about most things, Adeline said. He's been very honest with me. She smiled. He's an honest man. I find that's his best quality. Vivian looked at her. The social surface held, but underneath it something was recalibrating. Adeline could see it, the way you see the current in a river that looks still from the bank. You've made quite an impression on him, Vivian said. In a short time. We've had 4 months, Adeline said. And I intend to have many more. Now will you excuse me? I should check on the supper arrangements. She walked away with the calm of a woman who has said exactly what she meant and is entirely at peace with having said it. She did not look back, but she counted 12 steps before she exhaled. The supper was served at 10:30 and the room rearranged itself around the tables with the comfortable ease of a crowd that has been well fed and well entertained and is now settling into the deeper pleasure of a good evening. Adeline moved through it, checking that guests had what they needed, that Mrs. Greer's staff was managing the flow correctly, that the conversation was finding its own rhythm. She was near the east windows when she heard Vivian's voice behind her. Not directed at her, directed at a cluster of 3 women, Mrs. Alcott, Mrs. Pemberton, and a woman Adeline didn't know well. A Mrs. Farrow from up near the ridge. Vivian's back was to Adeline. She clearly did not know Adeline was within earshot. She's efficient, Vivian was saying, with the particular tone of a compliment assembled from materials that aren't quite compliments. One has to grant her that. 4 months, and she's already reorganized the household. Opened the east drawing room. She moves very fast. She seems very capable, Mrs. Alcott offered carefully. Oh, entirely, though one does wonder, Vivian paused. He chose her because her father arranged it before he died. It was a practical matter. I don't think he had much say in it. Frankly, Mrs. Pemberton said, he seems kind, Vivian said. He has always been kind, even when he didn't feel the things that would justify the kindness. Another pause. I saw him at the Hendersons in September before she arrived. He was well. He was the way he's been for years. Absent, you know how he is. How he's been since Clara. I don't think anything has actually changed. I think he's simply learned to be better at performing. Adeline stepped forward. Vivian, she said. The 3 women turned last. And the expression on her face, the microsecond of something raw before the social mask reassembled, told Adeline everything she needed to know. Adeline, Vivian said. Warmly. Perfectly. We were just saying what a lovely evening. I heard what you were saying, Adeline said. Quietly, without aggression, simply as a statement of fact. The cluster of women went very still. Adeline looked at Vivian steadily. I understand that you cared for him very much, she said. And I understand that what happened with Clara and after was genuinely painful for you. I don't doubt any of that. Vivian's chin lifted slightly. But I'd ask you, Adeline said, to have this conversation somewhere other than my house. With someone other than my guests, at a time other than tonight. As a courtesy. One long, brittle silence. Mrs. Alcott was looking at the floor. Mrs. Pemberton was looking at the ceiling. Mrs. Farrow had the frozen expression of someone who had not anticipated being present at something like this and was not sure where to point her eyes. Vivienne said coarsely, smoothly. I meant no offense, I know, Adeline said. And she turned and walked back toward the center of the room. Her hands were steady. Her heart was not quite. But she had said what needed saying, and she had said it without cruelty, and she was not going to apologize for it. She found a footman and took a glass of water and drank half of it standing near the doorway. And she let the noise of the room cover the next 30 seconds while she put herself back together. Then she went to speak to the assemblymen's wives and spent 20 minutes being exactly who she needed to be. Because that was what tonight required. The next blow came from a direction she hadn't guarded. It was nearly midnight. The dancing had resumed and the supper tables were being cleared, and the evening was in that final golden hour before guests began to make their departures. Adeline was standing near the east windows, the same windows where she'd overheard Vivienne in conversation with Mrs. Holt, who had arrived late and kissed her on both cheeks and said, "Look at this room. Look at what you've done with this house," with a sincerity that had been genuinely sustaining. Mrs. Holt squeezed her arm and said quietly, "Watch that woman." Adeline said, "I am." "No," Mrs. Holt said. "I mean, watch where she's going right now." Adeline looked. Vivienne was crossing the room toward Nathaniel. He was speaking to Judge Alcott near the fireplace. Vivienne approached with the ease of long familiarity, not interrupting. Simply joining, the way a person does when they know they will be welcomed. And Nathaniel did welcome her, because he was a courteous man, and she was a guest he had invited, and he did not know what Adeline knew. Adeline watched Vivienne lean toward him and say something that made him go still. Not the ordinary stillness, the weighted kind. The kind that meant something had pressed against a structure, and the structure was working to hold. He looked up from that stillness, and his eyes found Adeline across the room. The look was quick, unreadable. She held it. He looked away. "What did she say to him?" Mrs. Holt murmured beside her. "I don't know yet," Adeline said. She set down her glass. She crossed the room. She did not hurry. She moved at the pace of a woman who belongs everywhere she goes and is in no particular rush. She reached Nathaniel's side and put her hand lightly on his arm, a gesture she had never made before tonight. Deliberate and clear, and smiled at Judge Alcott. "Judge," she said, "what a lovely evening you've had." Alcott beamed. "Finest ball in 3 years, Mrs. Caldwell. 3 years at least." She felt Nathaniel's arm shift slightly under her hand. Not pulling away. The opposite, a minute adjustment. Like a person steadying themselves against something. Vivienne was standing 3 feet away, her expression perfectly composed. "Vivienne," Adeline said, "are you enjoying the evening?" "Immensely," Vivienne said. "I was just telling Nathaniel how much I've appreciated seeing this room come back to life." It was so dear to Clara. She would have paused. Precisely placed. Well, she would have had opinions about the changes. "I imagine she would have," Adeline said. "Most people with good taste do." A fractional silence. Then Vivienne said, "She had very particular ideas about this house. About what it should be. Nathaniel knows." She looked at him with the ease of shared history. The kind of ease that is designed to exclude. "Don't," Nathaniel said. Carefully, Clara had strong opinions about many things. She did. Vivienne's smile softened became. For a moment, something that looked genuinely sorrowful. Which was the most dangerous version of her, because it was probably real. "I miss her terribly. I always will." She looked at Adeline. It must be difficult. Living in the shadow of someone so beloved, the room around them had not stopped. Music still played, conversation still moved. But in this small circle, near the fireplace, 3 people were engaged in something that had nothing to do with the dancing. Adeline looked at Vivienne. She thought about what she could say. She thought about all the precise, accurate, quietly devastating things she could place into this conversation right now. And she thought about what they would cost, and whether the cost was worth it. She said, "I don't live in Clara's shadow. I live in this house. With my husband in our life. Clara mattered to him enormously, and I honor that. But I'm not competing with someone who isn't here. She paused. I don't think that's something anyone should have to do. Vivian's composure held. But her eyes just for a moment showed something that was not composure at all. Judge Alcott, who was a perceptive man despite his hearty surface, said, "Well, my wife will be looking for me. Lovely to see you." Vivian, Mrs. Caldwell, magnificent evening, and excused himself with the speed of a man who has recognized an exit and taken it. And then it was the three of them. Nathaniel said, "Vivian, I hope you'll enjoy the rest of the evening." His voice was pleasant. It was also final. A long look, full of things she was choosing not to say. Then she smiled. Gracious to the last, and said, "Of course, good night, Nathaniel." And to Adeline, Mrs. Caldwell, "Thank you for a lovely party." She turned and then moved back into the room. Adeline stood still for a moment. Then Nathaniel said, very quietly, "What did she say to you earlier?" Near the windows, she looked at him. "You heard about that. Mrs. Alcott has a guilty expression, and Mrs. Greer has been watching you for the past 2 hours, in the way she watches things she thinks I should know about." He looked at her steadily. "What did she say?" "Nothing I couldn't manage," Adeline said. "Adeline." She turned to face him. "She said you married me because my father arranged it. That nothing had actually changed in you. That you were simply better at performing." She held his gaze. "I told her to have that conversation somewhere other than my house." He was very still. "She's wrong," he said. "I know she's wrong," Adeline said. "I have been watching you for 4 months, and I know exactly what has changed and what hasn't. And she is wrong." She kept her voice even. "But I thought you should know," she said it. He looked at her for a long moment. The full, direct look that she had come to understand meant he was seeing her clearly and making no effort to look away. "Thank you," he said, "for telling me." And he stopped. "For tonight. All of it," she said. "We should go say goodnight to the Alcotts. They'll be leaving soon." "Yes," he said. But he didn't move immediately. He stood there for just a moment longer, looking at her in a room that was full of candlelight and music and the warmth of a house that had decided to be alive again. Then he offered her his arm. She took it. They walked back into the room together. And the evening resumed around them like a river closing over a stone. And no one watching them would have seen anything except a man and woman moving through their own home with the ease of people who had always belonged in the same space. The guests departed between midnight and 1. Nathaniel stood beside Adeline at the door and shook hands and kissed cheeks and said all the right things. And she stood beside him and did the same. And when the last carriage rolled down the drive and Mrs. Greer began directing the staff to clear, the house settled into the quiet of a place that had held something large and is now letting it go. Adeline stood in the entrance hall and felt the quiet settle over her. She was tired, the kind of tired that isn't unpleasant, the tired of a thing done and done well. Her feet ached. Her jaw ached from so many hours of smiling with complete attention. There was a small, persistent tension behind her right eye that had been there since the conversation near the east windows. Nathaniel came back in from seeing the last guests off. He looked at her and said, "Sit down." She raised her eyebrows. "You've been on your feet for 7 hours," he said. "Sit down," she almost argued. Then she sat down on the bench in the entrance hall, which was not a bench designed for sitting. It was the kind of narrow, decorative piece that communicates that this is not a place for lingering, and she felt the relief of it move up through her legs with a gratitude that surprised her. He sat down beside her. They sat in the entrance hall of Caldwell Manor with the sound of the staff clearing around them and the candles burning down in their sconces. And neither of them said anything for a while. Then Nathaniel said, "When I was speaking to Vivian near the fireplace, before you came over." "Yes," she said, "she told me something." He was looking at his hands. "About you. About what she'd heard in the county. That there was talk before the marriage, that you had hoped for a match with someone else. A man in Mercer County. That you had agreed to our marriage only because your father gave you no alternative. Adeline was quiet for a moment. "There was a man," she said, "in Mercer County. We had an understanding. Of a kind, nothing formal. When my father proposed this arrangement, that understanding ended." She paused. "It was not I was not in love with him. But I had expected that to be my life." Nathaniel was still looking at his hands. "Did you grieve it?" "Briefly," she said. "And then I decided to be practical about what was in front of me instead." She turned to look at him. "Vivian told you that to make you feel guilty, as though you had taken something from me." "Had stolen my intended life," had he asked, quietly. "No," she said. "My father had his reasons and I had mine, and neither of us was coerced." She held his gaze. "You did not steal my life, Nathaniel. You are my life. Whatever we make of it from here." He looked at her. It was the longest he had held her gaze in 4 months of marriage. It lasted long enough that she was aware of her own heartbeat, aware of the precise quality of his attention, aware that something in the space between them had shifted so completely tonight that the version of this marriage that had existed at the start of the evening was not the version that would exist by morning. He lifted his hand. He touched her face just briefly. Just his fingers against her jaw, and then he dropped his hand. "Thank you," he said. "For tonight. For all of it. For everything you've done in this house." He paused. "For being someone I didn't expect." She said, "Go to bed." "Nathaniel, you're tired," he almost smiled. The almost smile she had collected carefully over 4 months. Each one a small precious thing. "Good night, Adeline," he said. He went upstairs. She sat in the entrance hall for another minute, alone, with the candles burning down around her. She pressed her fingers to her jaw where his hand had been. She sat there for a long moment. Then she stood, straightened her spine, and went to help Mrs. Greer with the clearing. Because she was Adeline Mercer Caldwell, and there was work to be done, and she had never been a woman who sat with a feeling when there was something useful she could do with her hands. But she carried it with her, through the rest of the clearing, through the checking of the fires, through the long walk upstairs to her room. The warmth of it, the unexpected, carefully tended, absolutely real warmth of it. She was almost asleep when she heard it, a sound so faint she couldn't be certain she hadn't imagined it. Footsteps in the corridor, deliberate, moving past her door, moving toward the end of the hall, the sound of a key. A door opening, staying open. She lay in the dark and listened to the silence from the direction of that room, the room that had been locked for 5 years and opened twice now, and she thought about a man sitting with his past in the quiet of the small hours, with the door open this time, letting the air of the rest of the house move through. She thought that was one of the bravest things she had ever witnessed. She closed her eyes. She slept. And 40 miles away, in a hired room at the inn outside Charlottesville, a man named Aldous Cray read a letter for the second time and folded it carefully and put it in his breast pocket. The letter was from Vivian Hartwell. It contained 3 paragraphs about Nathaniel Caldwell's estate, the terms of the original Mercer marriage contract, and a question carefully worded, carefully deniable, about whether certain information regarding Edmund Mercer's finances in the year before his death might be of interest to certain parties who were currently examining the probate record. Cray was a lawyer, not a good one, not the kind that built reputations on integrity, the kind that built them on knowing where the soft places were in other people's arrangements. He tucked the letter into his pocket and picked up his pen. He began to write. 3 days after the ball, a letter arrived at Caldwell Manor addressed to Nathaniel. Adeline was in the library when she heard the front door. She heard Nathaniel's voice in the entrance hall, a brief exchange with the footman, and then silence. Then footsteps, not toward the study, where he usually took his correspondence. Toward the library. He came through the door with the letter in his hand, and his expression, to start particular controlled register that she had learned over 4 months to read with some accuracy. This was not the ordinary controlled register. This was the one he used when something had pressed against the structure from the outside, and he was deciding. rapidly, how much pressure it was actually exerting. He held out the letter. She took it, she read it. It was from a solicitor named Aldous Cray, based in Charlottesville. The language was careful, the kind of careful that takes effort. The kind that means every word has been chosen for what it doesn't say as much as what it does. The substance of it was a request for a meeting regarding certain questions that had arisen in the review of the late Edmund Mercer's probate record. Questions, the letter said, that pertain to the validity of certain debts documented in the estate filings. Questions that, if not addressed promptly, might require the involvement of the county court. She read it twice. Then she set it down on the reading table and said, "Who is Aldous Cray?" "I don't know him," Nathaniel said. "Hargrove might. He's not a name I recognize from the county bar. He's from Charlottesville," she said. "Not local." She looked at the letter again. The debts he's referencing, those were part of the marriage contract. "The Mercer debts that you agreed to assume. My father's financial position was reviewed by your solicitor before the contract was signed." "Yes. Then there are no questions about them," she said. "They were documented and verified." "That's what I would have said this morning," Nathaniel said. "Before this arrived." She looked at him. "You think someone sent this?" "I think solicitors from Charlottesville don't spontaneously develop an interest in a probate record from Mercer County without a reason," he said. "I think this arrived 3 days after we had 46 guests in this house, one of whom left earlier than the others and seemed—" He stopped. "Seemed what?" she said. "Unsatisfied," he said. The words sat between them. "Vivian Hartwell." Adeline looked at the letter for a long moment. She thought about the 3 paragraphs Vivian had spoken near the east windows before she knew she was being heard. She thought about the way Vivian had watched her all evening with that perfectly composed smile. She thought about a woman who had loved Nathaniel Caldwell for 6 years and watched someone else move into his house at open rooms that had been locked and dance with him in the east drawing room and touch his arm in front of 46 witnesses. She thought about how much that would cost a person. How much damage a person in that kind of pain might decide they were justified in doing. "Hargrove," she said. "We need Hargrove today." "I've already sent word," Nathaniel said. She looked up at him. "I read the letter at 7 this morning," he said. "I waited until a reasonable hour to show it to you because I didn't want to wake you. Not because I had any intention of managing this without you." He held her gaze. "This involves your family's name. I wouldn't manage it without you," she said. After a moment, "Thank you." "Don't thank me," he said. "Just tell me what you know about your father's finances in the last year before he died." "Everything. Even things that seemed inconsequential." She sat down. She told him. Hargrove arrived by midday. He was a small, precise man of 60, with the quality of absolute stillness that belongs to people who have spent a lifetime in rooms where saying the wrong thing has consequences. He read Cray's letter 3 times, set it on Nathaniel's desk, and said, "I know this name, Cray," Nathaniel said. "He's not a practicing solicitor in the traditional sense," Hargrove said carefully. "He practices technically, but his primary business for the past several years has been in the acquisition of contested estate claims. He finds irregularities, or creates the appearance of them. Then he offers to make the irregularities disappear in exchange for a settlement," Adeline said. "He's a blackmailer." Hargrove looked at her. "That is a precise way of putting it." "Mrs. Caldwell, he would say he is a legal advocate for aggrieved parties." "Who is the aggrieved party?" Nathaniel said. "The letter doesn't specify," Hargrove said, "but someone retained him. Someone who knew enough about the Mercer estate's probate record to point him toward it." The 3 of them sat with that for a moment. Then Adeline said, "What exactly would he be looking for?" "In my father's records," Hargrove folded his hands. "If there were any debts your father documented that could be characterized as fraudulent, inflated, fabricated, entered into the record without proper basis, someone could argue that the marriage contract, which was predicated on those debts, was itself founded on misrepresentation, which would call the contract's validity into question." And if the contract's validity were questioned, Nathaniel said. The assets transferred under it could theoretically be contested, Hargrove said, including the Mercer property that was folded into the estate. Adeline was very still. Are there any such debts? Nathaniel asked her directly. No, she said. My father's debts were real. I know because I watched them accumulate. I watched him borrow against the land when the harvest failed 2 years running. I watched him take the mill loan when the equipment broke down and we didn't have capital to repair it. Every debt in that record I can account for because I was there for most of them. She paused. But, Hargrove said, but he was ill for 2 years, she said. In the last 6 months he was not consistent. He was still himself. But he was also on laudanum for the pain, and there were periods when his judgment was affected. I managed the correspondence as much as I could, but there were things that went through without my knowledge. She looked at Hargrove steadily. If someone wanted to find a period of vulnerability in those records, the last 6 months would be where they'd look. Hargrove was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I need to see the original Mercer probate documents. The full record, not the summary your father's solicitor provided at the time of the contract. Can you get them? Nathaniel said. I can go to Mercer County tomorrow, Hargrove said. But I'll need authorization from Mrs. Caldwell as a named party in the estate. You have it, Adeline said. Write whatever you need me to sign. Hargrove left with 2 signed documents and instructions to send word the moment he had reviewed the full record. The house was quiet after he went. Nathaniel stood at the window of his study with his back to the room. And Adeline sat in the chair across from his desk and looked at the empty surface where the letter had been before Hargrove took it away. She was not frightened, or she was. Precisely the kind of frightened that presents as very focused and very still, the kind that her father used to call her ice in the veins look, which he had meant as a compliment and she had accepted as one. What she felt underneath the focus was something colder and more specific. Anger, not at Vivian exactly. Anger required a simplicity that this situation didn't have. What she felt was the particular, clarifying fury of a woman who has done everything right, who has walked into a difficult situation with patience and intelligence and genuine care, and discovered that someone has been in the background working to undo it. Not honestly, not directly, through lawyers and probate records and carefully worded letters designed to create the appearance of impropriety in a dead man's financial affairs. Her father's affairs. Edmund Mercer, who had spent 2 years dying slowly and in considerable pain, who had arranged his daughter's marriage in his last clear months because he wanted her safe, who had loved her as completely and imperfectly as any father ever loved a daughter. His name was potentially attached to a fraud he had not committed by a lawyer retained by a woman who wanted his daughter's marriage dismantled. She breathed. She kept the anger in the place where it was useful behind the sternum, where it produced heat and clarity rather than spillage. She said, Nathaniel. He turned from the window. She went to considerable effort, Adeline said. This isn't a spontaneous reaction. You don't find Aldous Cray in 3 days. You find Aldous Cray because you already knew where to look, which means she started looking before the ball, possibly before we opened the invitations. He came and sat down across from her. Not behind the desk. In the chair beside her, which put them at the same level, which she noticed. I know, he said. Did you know what she was capable of? She asked. Not accusingly. She genuinely wanted to know. He was quiet for a moment. I knew she was not. I knew that her acceptance of my decision years ago was not as complete as she presented. I told myself it was private grief and that I had no claim on what a person does with private grief. He met her eyes. I underestimated the degree to which it had become something else. Something else, she said. Something that needed an object, he said. For a long time the object was absence. She grieved and was disappointed and stayed in her own life. But when you came, when the house changed, when the things that had been locked started opening, he stopped. I think she found an object. Adeline said me. The marriage, he said. You. The fact of you. He looked at her steadily. The fact that in 4 months you had done what stopped again. What she hadn't done in 6 years, Adeline said quietly. He didn't answer that directly, but his silence was its own answer. She said, "We have to get in front of this before Cray makes any formal moves. If he approaches the county court directly, even a groundless claim creates a public record. And a public record creates talk, and talk in this county has a way of becoming a version of events that's very difficult to correct afterward." "Agreed," he said. "Hargrove will have the documents within the week." "That may not be fast enough," she said. She stood up. "I'm going to write to my father's solicitor directly. Thomas Webb, he handled everything. He knows every document in that record personally. If there is anything in those files that could be misconstrued, Webb will know it and he'll know how to address it." She moved toward the door. "I'll also write to Rosalind. She was there for those last months. She may remember things I don't." "Adeline," she turned. He was standing now. He looked not uncertain exactly. Something more than that. Like a man who has something to say and is deciding whether he has the right to say it. "Whatever is in those records," he said, "it doesn't change anything here. I want you to know that." She looked at him. "Whatever Cray finds or claims to find," he said. "This marriage is not contingent on the financial basis that preceded it. It was contingent on that at the beginning. It is not contingent on that now." He held her gaze. "I want you to know that clearly." She said, "I know." "Do you?" he said. She crossed back toward him, slowly, and stopped 2 feet away. Close enough that she could see the exact quality of what was in his face, the effortful honesty of a man who has decided that something must be said and is saying it regardless of what it costs him. "Nathaniel," she said, "I know. I have been watching you for 4 months. I know exactly what this is." She paused. "And I know exactly what I intend to protect." He was very still. Then he said, "I should have looked at you. On the aisle. On the day we married. I should have turned around." She felt it land the full weight of it. Without defenses, and she let it. "Yes," she said. "You should have." "I'm sorry," he said. For the second time. The first had been measured, deliberate, a decision made carefully. This one was different. This one came from somewhere lower and less managed. She said, "I know you are." They stood close in the quiet of the study. And she thought about everything that had been built in 4 months, the ledgers on the library floor, the east fence, the supper table conversations, the south lease, the locked room, the dance in the east drawing room, and she thought that it was real. All of it. More real than anything Aldous Cray could find in a probate record. She said, "Write to Hargrove and tell him to prioritize the last 6 months of the estate record. That's where any vulnerability would be." He nodded. "I'll be in the library," she said. She went to the library, and she sat at the writing desk, and she wrote 3 letters in quick succession: Thomas Webb, Rosalind, and a brief, carefully worded note to Judge Alcott asking whether, as a courtesy between neighbors, he might be willing to advise her on the procedural timeline for a contested probate matter. She did not mention Cray by name. She did not need to. She sealed all 3 and gave them to the footman and went back to the East Shelf ledgers. She had work to do. Webb's response arrived in 4 days. It was long and thorough, and written in the slightly fussy, over-precise style of a man who had been a country solicitor for 30 years and treated every document as a potential exhibit. Adeline read it at the library desk with Nathaniel standing beside her. And by the 3rd page she had gone very still. "What is it?" he said. She turned to the passage she had found and handed it to him. He read it. He read it again. In the last 4 months of Edmund Mercer's life, at a period when his judgment was compromised by illness and medication, he had signed a promissory note for a sum of $400. Payable to a land agent named Foster Greer, no relation to the housekeeper, for services related to a property survey. The survey had never been conducted. The note had been paid. The $400 had left the estate. And Foster Greer, according to Thomas Webb's footnote, had been disbarred from practicing as a land agent in Mercer County the following year for filing fraudulent survey documents on behalf of clients who had paid him for surveys he never conducted. He was defrauded, Adeline said. My father paid $400 for a survey that was never done. He was ill and someone took advantage of that. And if Cray's client is arguing that your father fabricated debts to inflate the state's liability before the marriage contract, they'll use this note, she said. They'll say it was fabricated. That my father created a false debt to make the estate appear more encumbered than it was. To make the marriage arrangement more favorable to our side. She pressed her fingers to the bridge of her nose. The fact that the land agent was fraudulent almost makes it worse. Because there's no survey record to corroborate the legitimate purpose of the payment. A long silence. Webb can testify that he believed it to be legitimate at the time, Nathaniel said. That's not the same as proving it, she said. No, he agreed. It's not. She stood up. She walked to the window. She stood with her back to him and her arms crossed, and she thought, not panicking. Not spiraling. Thinking with the cold, focused clarity that her father had always called her gift, and her mother had called her armor, and she had always called simply the thing she did when everything else failed. There was a survey that didn't exist, but there had been a reason for the survey. Why would my father hire a land agent to survey the East acreage? She said. Half to herself, in the last 4 months of his life. When he was already ill, when he had already arranged the marriage, Nathaniel said nothing. Waiting, because he thought the acreage was worth surveying, she said slowly. Because something about the East acreage warranted documentation. Something he wanted recorded before he died. She turned around. We need to go to Mercer County, the estate, he said. Rosalind is living in the house, she said. She's been there since the marriage. She knows every corner of that property. If my father was trying to have the East acreage surveyed, she'll know why. They left the next morning. The Mercer house was smaller than she remembered it. She stood in the doorway for just a moment when they arrived. Taking in the specific quality of a place you have returned to after time has changed you. The house had not changed. She had. Rosalind came out of the kitchen with flour on her hands and stopped on the step and said, Adeline, with a sound in her voice that Adeline recognized, the sound of someone who has been holding something alone for a long time and has just seen the person they would most like to hand it to. She embraced her sister. Over Rosalind's shoulder she saw Nathaniel standing back a few paces, giving them the distance, and she caught his eye for just a moment, and he gave a small nod. She turned back to Rosalind. Come inside, she said. I need to ask you something important. They sat in the front parlor, the three of them, and Adeline explained the situation clearly and without softening it. Because Rosalind was 20 and not fragile, and deserved the truth. She watched her sister's face move through several registrations alarm. Then focus, then something determined. The East acreage, Rosalind said immediately. Yes, I know exactly. Tell me, Adeline said. Papa thought there was coal on the East acreage, Rosalind said. He'd heard from 2 different men who worked the ridge that the soil formation on the east side was consistent with a coal seam. He hired Mr. Greer to survey it formally because he wanted documentation before the marriage contract was finalized. He wanted to make sure you knew what you were bringing to the marriage. He didn't want you to marry Mr. Caldwell without knowing the land might be worth considerably more than the contract suggested. The room was very quiet. Adeline said, he was trying to strengthen our position. He was trying to make sure you weren't undervalued, Rosalind said. That's exactly what he said. He said your sister should go into this knowing what she's worth. Not what she appears to be worth. Her voice cracked slightly on the last word. She steadied it. When Greer took the money and didn't do the survey. Papa was too ill to pursue it. He died 2 months later. I didn't know it would matter. Adeline looked at Nathaniel. He was looking at her with an expression she had not seen before and could not fully name something that was not quite any single thing, but that contained in it the recognition of a man who has just understood something important about a person he had failed. Early to see. She turned back to Rosalind. Do you know who Papa spoke to? The men from the ridge who told him about the coal formation? One of them, Rosalind said. A man named Aldrich. He works the North Ridge. He's still there. Adeline stood up. Can you take me to him? Rosalind looked at Nathaniel. Nathaniel said, How far is the North Ridge? 3 miles, Rosalind said. Then let's go today, he said. Aldrich was a weathered man of perhaps 65 who had spent most of his life working the ridgeland and who regarded the three of them from his porch with the particular wariness of a man who doesn't receive many visitors and trusts them less when they arrive in pairs. Adeline stepped forward before Nathaniel could. Mr. Aldrich, she said. My name is Adeline Caldwell. My father was Edmund Mercer. I believe you spoke to him about 2 years ago regarding the east acreage. The wariness shifted slightly. I remember Mr. Mercer, he said. Decent man. Sorry he passed. Thank you, she said. I need to ask you about what you told him. About the soil formation on the east side. He studied her for a moment. Then he looked at Nathaniel. That your yes. Sir, she said. He looked back at her. You ain't here to cause trouble? I'm here to prevent it, she said. There's a lawyer trying to use my father's payment to your former land agent as evidence that my father fabricated a debt. I need to be able to show what the survey was for and why he wanted it done. A long pause. Aldrich scratched the back of his neck. Then he said, I told your father there was coal on that east slope. Still believe it. The formation runs consistent with 3 other seams I've worked in this county. Wouldn't swear to the exact extent without a proper survey. But I'd swear to the formation. He looked at her steadily. Your father wanted that documented because he said his daughter was worth more than the papers showed. Adeline held the words for a moment. Would you put that in writing, she said. A sworn statement. Before Judge Alcott, attesting to the conversation you had with my father and your professional assessment of the formation. Aldrich studied her for a long time. I reckon I would, he said. Adeline said, thank you. Mr. Aldrich. She turned and walked back to where Nathaniel was standing at the edge of the yard. And she felt the weight of the last several days shifting on her shoulders, not disappearing, but moving into a different configuration, less like something pressing down and more like something she was carrying deliberately in a direction she had chosen. Nathaniel said quietly, Your father. Yes, she said. He knew the land might be worth considerably more than the contract reflected, he said. He was trying to get it documented before the marriage, so you would know. So you would go in knowing your value. Yes, she said again. He stood beside her for a moment without speaking. Then he said he was a good man. He was a very good man, she said. He just ran out of time. She looked back at the ridge at the east slope of the Mercer acreage, stretching away in the late afternoon light, ordinary looking from a distance, holding whatever it held beneath the surface. When this is resolved, she said, I'd like to have that survey done properly, by someone legitimate. Whatever is on that land, coal or nothing, I want it documented. We'll do it, Nathaniel said. Without hesitation, she nodded. They rode back toward the Mercer house in the declining light. And the silence between them was the comfortable kind, the kind that doesn't need filling. The kind that belongs to people who have been through something together and come out the other side, still standing shoulder to shoulder. 3 miles from the Mercer house, Nathaniel said. I need to tell you something. She glanced at him. When I agreed to this marriage, he said, looking at the road ahead, I told myself it was practical, that I was doing it because it was time, and because the arrangement was reasonable, and because I had been alone long enough that the practical arguments outweighed everything else. He paused. I told myself I could manage a marriage that was civil and functional, and nothing more. That I had already had the other kind, and losing it had cost me more than I could afford to lose again. She waited. I was wrong, he said. Not about the loss. The loss was real. But I was wrong about what I could afford. He turned and looked at her directly. I cannot afford to keep this distance, Adeline. I have been trying to manage you at a safe remove for 4 months, and it has not worked because you are not a person who stays at a safe remove. You walk into every space I have tried to keep empty, and you do something useful in it, and you leave it better than it was." He stopped. "I don't know how to tell you what these 4 months have meant. I am not practiced at saying things like that." She looked at him. She said, "You just," her gaze. "I heard you," she said quietly. "I hear you." The horses walked on. The valley spread around them in every direction, wide and old and holding them both inside it, and the last light fell across the east slope of the Mercer acreage, touching the surface of a thing that had been there a long time, waiting to be properly seen. Somewhere behind them in Charlottesville, Aldous Cray was composing a letter that he believed would produce a profitable result. He had not yet heard from Judge Alcott. He was about to. Judge Alcott's response arrived on a Thursday morning. And it was not a letter, it was the judge himself, standing in the entrance hall of Caldwell Manor, with his coat still on and his hat in his hands, having ridden out from town without sending word ahead. Adeline came downstairs to find him there, and she read his expression before he said a word, the expression of a man who has discovered something that requires more urgency than correspondence allows. "Judge," she said. "Come in." Nathaniel appeared from the study doorway. He took one look at Alcott and said, "Sit down, William. Tell us." They went to the study, all three of them. And Alcott sat in the chair across from the desk and said, "Without preamble, Cray filed yesterday. Not with the county court, with the circuit court in Charlottesville. He's named the Mercer estate as the respondent in a contested probate action, and he's petitioned for a freeze on any assets transferred under the marriage contract pending review." The room was very still. Adeline said, "He went to the circuit court directly." "Not the county court. He bypassed the county entirely," Alcott said. "Which tells me he knows he wouldn't get traction here, where people knew Edmund Mercer and know this family. He filed where he has a better chance of getting a sympathetic ear before anyone can respond," Nathaniel said. "Who is the petitioning party? Who retained him?" Alcott looked at his hat. "The filing names a Mrs. Vivian Hartwell as the interested party, on the grounds that she has standing as a creditor of the Mercer estate." He paused. "She's claiming that Edmund Mercer owed a sum of money to her late father, a debt allegedly contracted in 1854 and never satisfied. She's using Cray to argue that the marriage contract, which absorbed the estate's documented liabilities, should have included this debt and that the omission was fraudulent." Adeline heard the words land, each one with the particular clarity of something you were half expecting and are still not entirely prepared for. A debt to Vivian's father, 1854, never documented, never mentioned in any proceeding, appearing now 4 months after the marriage, 3 weeks after the ball. She said, "There is no such debt." "I believe you," Alcott said. "But believing you and proving it in circuit court are two different things. And Cray knows that. He's not trying to win. He's trying to make the process expensive and public enough that a settlement becomes the more attractive option." Nathaniel said, "What kind of settlement?" Alcott said, "The filing doesn't specify. It never does at this stage. But I've seen this pattern before. He'll approach through Hargrove in the next week or two with a number. Something large enough to be painful, small enough to seem manageable compared to a protracted court proceeding." Nathaniel looked at Adeline. She was looking at the desk surface not blankly, but with the concentrated inward focus of someone running a very fast calculation. "We're not settling," she said. Adeline, Nathaniel began. "We are not settling," she said again. She looked up. "If we settle, we are paying Vivian Hartwell to have attacked my father's name and my family's integrity. We are confirming, in the public record, that there was something worth settling. There wasn't. My father did not owe her father money, and she knows it. And Cray knows it. And paying them to go away teaches them to do it again to the next family they find with a dead man's estate and a marriage contract worth contesting. She looked at Alcott. What do we need to bring this before the circuit court on its merits? Alcott studied her for a moment with the careful attention of a man reassessing his prior estimate of a person. A sworn rebuttal from a party with direct knowledge of Edmund Mercer's financial affairs in the relevant period. Documentation of every debt in the estate record with corroborating evidence. And he paused. Ideally, some evidence that the alleged debt to Hartwell's father either never existed or was satisfied. Thomas Webb was my father's solicitor for 20 years, Adeline said. Every financial transaction of significance went through him. If there had been a debt to Hartwell's father, Webb would know it. Can Webb testify to its absence? He can testify to everything he handled, she said. And to his knowledge of everything he didn't. I'll write to him today. I'll ask him to come to Charlottesville. She looked at Nathaniel. And Aldrich. His sworn statement about the coal survey establishes the legitimate purpose of the payment Cray is trying to characterize as fabricated. We take away his strongest piece and the rest of the filing falls apart, Nathaniel said. How long do we have before the freeze takes effect? 30 days from filing, Alcott said. But I can file a motion to contest the freeze on procedural grounds. That gives us another 2 weeks at minimum. File it, Nathaniel said. Alcott nodded. He stood. He put his hat back on. He looked at Adeline for a moment and said, Your father was a well-regarded man in this county. Mrs. Caldwell, I want you to know that, she said. Thank you, Judge. The room was quiet. Nathaniel said. You didn't hesitate. This will be public, he said. Whatever happens in that courtroom will be talked about. People will hear Cray's allegations before they hear the rebuttal. I know, she said. Let them hear both. I'm not afraid of a courtroom and I'm not afraid of this county. She met his eyes. My father spent his whole life being a decent man in this community. I am not going to let him be remembered as something else, because a woman with a grievance hired a lawyer with flexible principles. She paused. Are you with me? He said without any hesitation at all. Completely. The next 2 weeks moved at the pace of a thing being built under pressure, fast and deliberate, and with no room for second-guessing. Thomas Webb came from Mercer County on a Tuesday and spent 2 days at Caldwell Manor going through every document Adeline could compile, cross-referencing against his own records, building the rebuttal with the methodical patience of a man who had been waiting 30 years for his meticulous record-keeping to matter in exactly this way. He was 71 and slightly deaf in one ear, and he moved slowly. But his memory for financial particulars was absolute. And when he said on the second evening, in 20 years of managing Edmund Mercer's affairs, I have no record and no recollection of any financial relationship between Edmund Mercer and the Hartwell family of any kind, he said it with the flat certainty of a man stating a fact about his own name. Adeline wrote it down. She had him sign it. She had Nathaniel witness it. Aldrich came down from the ridge on a Friday, having traveled 3 hours by horse, and sat in Judge Alcott's office in town and gave his sworn statement in the measured, direct language of a man who has worked the land long enough to understand the difference between what he knows and what he suspects, and who is careful to speak only to the former. He knew the formation. He had told Edmund Mercer about the formation. Edmund Mercer had hired a land agent to survey it formally. That was what he knew. He said it clearly, and he signed the statement, and he rode the 3 hours home. Hargrove filed both statements with the circuit court on a Monday. On Wednesday, Cray contacted Hargrove. The offer was $1,200. Adeline read the number and put the letter down and said, No. Hargrove said carefully, Mrs. Caldwell, $1,200 is the price he thinks we're willing to pay to make this go away quietly, she said. We're not. She looked at Nathaniel. We're not. Nathaniel looked at Hargrove. Tell him no. Hargrove looked between them. Then he nodded. Very well. The circuit court hearing was set for the 14th of January. The night before, Adeline sat at the writing desk in her room and did not write anything. She sat with her hands flat on the desk, and she looked at the wall, and she thought about her father. She thought about him at 35, the age she now understood he had been when she was born, younger than she had ever quite comprehended a parent could be. She thought about him at 50, sitting across from Nathaniel Caldwell at a supper table with a dying man's determination to do one final useful thing. She thought about the East acreage, and the coal foreman, and the land agent who took his money and gave him nothing. And the fact that even dying, even compromised, he had been trying to make sure she knew what she was worth. She pressed her hands flat on the desk. She heard a knock at the door. "Come in," she said. Nathaniel opened the door and stood in the frame. He was still dressed, which meant he hadn't tried to sleep either. "I saw the light under your door," he said. "I was thinking," she said. "About tomorrow?" "About my father," she said. "He came in." He did not sit down. He came and stood beside the desk, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him. And he looked at her with the full, direct look that had become, over these months, the thing she recognized most immediately as him. "He would be proud of you," he said. "Whatever happens tomorrow," she said. "I know." She paused. "I'm not doing this to make him proud. I'm doing it because it's right." "I know," he said. "That's what he'd be proud of." She looked up at him. He held out his hand, not a gesture of comfort exactly. Something more than that. Something that said, "Here. This is where I am. This is where I intend to stay. Take it or leave it, but know that it is offered without reservation." She took his hand. They stayed like that for a moment, her sitting, him standing, her hand in his, and she thought about the aisle again. The way she had counted fence posts and held her bouquet in both hands and walked toward a man who was not looking. She thought about the distance between that morning and this one. "Go to bed," she said finally. "We both need to sleep." He pressed her hand once. Then he released it. "Good night," she said. He went to the door, stopped, said without turning, "Whatever happens tomorrow, this house is yours. I am yours. That is not contingent on any court's opinion." He left. She sat for a long time after the door closed. Then she blew out the candle and went to bed and slept better than she had in 2 weeks. The circuit courtroom in Charlottesville was a high-ceilinged room that smelled of old wood and paper and the accumulated weight of 1,000 prior proceedings. Adeline sat beside Hargrove at the respondent's table, and she looked straight ahead, and she kept her hands still in her lap. Nathaniel sat directly behind her. She had told him he didn't need to come. He had said, "I know," and come anyway. Cray was at the petitioner's table, a compact man of perhaps 50, with the well-groomed precision of someone who understood that appearances in courtrooms are part of the argument. He had arranged his documents in a neat stack. He did not look at Adeline. Vivian sat beside him. She was dressed in dove gray, which was either a coincidence or a calculation, and she held herself with the composure of a woman who has committed to a course of action and is not going to let her face reveal any doubts she might have about it. She looked at Adeline once when they came in. Adeline looked back. Steady, without anger, without appeal, simply, "I see you. I know what you've done, and I am here." Vivian looked away first. The circuit judge was a man named Harwell, no relation. Hargrove had confirmed, who had the efficient, slightly impatient manner of someone who had seen too many cases of this type and had strong views about the use of the court's time. He read through the filing and the rebuttal with equal speed, asked 3 clarifying questions of Hargrove, and then turned to Cray. "Counselor," he said, "your petitioning party claims a debt owed to her late father by Edmund Mercer, contracted in 1854. What documentation do you have of this debt?" Cray said, "Your Honor, the debt was informal in nature, a personal loan between 2 men of standing who did not feel a formal instrument was necessary." "An undocumented debt," Judge Harwell said. "An informally contracted, undocumented," Harwell repeated. "What witnesses do you have to the transaction?" Cray said. "Mrs. Hartwell was present as a child when the arrangement was discussed." "She was a child," Harwell said. "How old?" 7, Your Honor." The courtroom was very quiet. Harwell looked at Cray for a long moment. Then he looked at Hargrove. Counselor, your rebuttal includes a sworn statement from the deceased solicitor of 20 years. Yes. Your Honor, Hargrove said. Mr. Thomas Webb, who managed every significant financial transaction of Mr. Mercer's adult life, attests to no knowledge of any financial relationship between the Mercer and Hartwell families of any kind. And the statement regarding the promissory note for the land survey. From Mr. James Aldrich, a working surveyor of 30 years' experience on the ridge properties of Mercer County, attesting to the conversation he had with Mr. Mercer that motivated the Survey Commission and to his professional assessment of the coal formation on the east acreage. Hartwell looked back at Cray. Cray said, Your Honor, the rebuttal evidence does not address. It addresses the only substantive allegation in your filing, Hartwell said. The promissory note you characterized as a fabricated debt has been corroborated by an independent professional witness with no financial interest in the outcome. He tapped the documents in front of him. You have presented an undocumented debt recalled by a 7-year-old. No corroborating witnesses, and no supporting documentation of any kind. Against a 20-year solicitor's sworn attestation and an independent professional's sworn statement. He paused. Do you have anything else? Craig, Your Honor. I would request additional time to know, Hartwell said. One word, flat and final as a door closing. The petition is dismissed, Hartwell said. The freeze request is denied. The respondent's costs will be borne by the petitioning party. He looked at Cray with the expression of a man making a note he intends to remember. I would counsel you, Counselor, to be considerably more selective in the matters you bring before this court in future. He struck his gavel. It was over. Adeline sat still for a moment after the gavel came down. Then she felt Nathaniel's hand on her shoulder from behind brief. Firm there and then not, and she stood up and turned around, and he was standing, he was looking at her with an expression she had not seen before on his face. Something unguarded and full and real, the expression of a man who has stopped managing what his face is allowed to show. She said, well, he said yes. She almost laughed. She held it back, because they were still in a courtroom, and Hargrove was beside her gathering documents, and across the room, Cray was stacking his papers with the careful movements of a man preserving whatever dignity remained available to him. Vivienne had already risen. She was moving toward the door. She did not look back. Adeline watched her go. She felt not triumph. Not the sharp satisfaction she might have expected. Something quieter and more durable than triumph. The feeling of having done a thing correctly. Of having stood where she was supposed to stand and held what she was supposed to hold, and not given an inch that wasn't hers to give. She thought, Papa, we're all right. She thought it the way you think things to people who are no longer there, not expecting an answer. Not needing one, just the particular human need to share a thing with the person you most wish were present. Then she turned to Nathaniel and said, I'd like to go home. Yes, he said. Let's go home. They were 2 miles outside Charlottesville when Nathaniel said, I want to tell you something. She looked at him across the carriage. He was looking at his hands, in the way he did, when he was organizing something important before he spoke. She had learned to wait for this to give him the room to assemble what he needed to say without filling the silence. When Clara died, he said, I stopped believing I was owed a life that contained anything good. I told myself I was being realistic, that people simply have that kind of good thing once. And when it goes, the correct response is to stop expecting it. He paused. I had 5 years of being correct about that. 5 years of a life that was functional and empty, and exactly what I had decided I deserved. He looked up. And then your father sat across my supper table and asked me to take care of his daughter, he said. And I agreed because it was practical, and because I was tired of the emptiness. Not because I believed anything would actually change. He held her gaze. I was wrong. About what I deserved, about what was possible. About you, she said, Nathaniel. I should have turned around, he said. On the aisle. I should have turned around and looked at you, and I didn't. And I have thought about that moment every single day since you said it to me in the study. He paused. I am not going to be done apologizing for that for a long time. But I am done being absent. I am done managing the distance between us. I am done treating my own capacity for feeling like something dangerous that has to be controlled." The carriage moved through the winter afternoon, and the valley spread out around them. And she looked at him, this man who had taken 4 months to turn around, and she felt the full weight of what he was saying move through her without resistance. She said, "I knew who you were before you knew who you were. Nathaniel, I have been watching you build something real for 4 months. I have been watching you choose something real, every day. One small choice at a time." She paused. "I fell in love with the man who was doing the building. Not the man at the beginning of it." He stared at her. She said it plainly, because she was Adeline Mercer Caldwell, and she did not dress things in language they didn't need. "I love you. I have loved you for some time. I was waiting for you to catch up." He moved across the carriage in one motion and took her face in both hands, the same hands that had barely touched hers on the day they married. Cold and brief and releasing before they'd fully landed, and he held her face like she was something he was finally. After a very long time, allowing himself to keep, he said, "Adeline," she said. "I know." He kissed her, not briefly, not mechanically, not with the managed correctness of a man performing a necessary gesture. He kissed her the way a man kisses a woman when he has stopped being afraid, with everything he had been withholding for 5 years pouring through it. Warm and certain, and without any reservation at all. When he finally drew back, he was still holding her face. She looked at him. "The East Acreage," she said, because she was still herself even in this moment. "I meant what I said about the survey." He laughed. It was a real laugh, not the brief, controlled, almost sound she had collected carefully over 4 months. A full, genuine laugh that changed his face completely, opened it up. Made him younger, made him the person he had been before a bridge gave way on a spring morning, and he had decided he was not allowed to be that person anymore. She looked at his face while he was laughing, and she thought, "There you are, there you finally are." "Yes," he said, when he had recovered. "We'll have the survey done." In the spring, she agreed. 3 weeks later, a letter arrived at Caldwell Manor from Vivienne Hartwell. Adeline opened it herself. She read it at the library desk. With the winter light coming through the east windows, and the house quiet around her in the particular way it was quiet now, not the emptied, held breath quiet of the early months, but the comfortable quiet of a place that is inhabited fully and knows it. The letter was 2 paragraphs. The first paragraph said that Vivienne had dismissed Aldous Cray and had no intention of pursuing any further legal action. The second paragraph said that she understood she had caused harm and that she did not expect forgiveness, but that she wanted Adeline to know she was aware of what she had done and would not repeat it. It was not an apology, quite. It was something more honest than an apology, an acknowledgement without expectation, which is the harder thing to write. Adeline sat with it for a while. Then she took out a sheet of paper and wrote a response that was exactly as long as the letter she had received. She said she appreciated the acknowledgement. She said she did not intend to carry the matter further. She said she hoped Vivienne would find in time the kind of life that did not require her to diminish anyone else's. She sealed it and gave it to the footman and did not think about Vivienne Hartwell again. Spring came early that year. The survey team arrived in March, legitimate men with proper instruments, retained by Hargrove at Adeline's direction, and they spent 4 days on the east acreage of the former Mercer property, now formally folded into the Caldwell estate by amended contract. Adeline rode out twice to check on their progress, and the second time Nathaniel rode out with her, and they sat on horseback on the rise above the east slope and watched the men work below them. The lead surveyor came up the rise at the end of the second day and said, with the restrained excitement of a professional man trying to stay objective about something that is clearly not nothing, "There's a seam, ma'am, not enormous, but substantial. Enough to be worth working, if you decide to pursue it." Adeline looked at Nathaniel. He looked at her. She thought about her father at his supper table, shaking a man's hand across the cloth, trying in his last clear months to make sure she knew what she was worth. She thought about Aldrich on the ridge, telling an ill man about the formation he'd spent 30 years learning to read. She thought about the $400 her father had paid in good faith to a man who took the money and gave him nothing, and how that act of ordinary trust had nearly been used to destroy his name. She thought about Nathaniel on an aisle in Hargrove Chapel, not turning, not looking, and then looking, eventually, and everything that had grown from that first, imperfect looking. "We'll pursue it," she told the surveyor. He nodded and went back down the rise. Nathaniel said, "Your father knew." "He always knew," she said. "He just ran out of time to prove it." She turned her horse back toward the manor, and Nathaniel turned with her. And they rode side by side through the spring morning, with the valley wide around them and the east slope opening up behind them toward the sky. When they reached the drive, Nathaniel held the gate for her, a gesture so ordinary and so natural that she almost didn't notice it. She noticed it. She noticed everything he did now, the same way she had noticed everything from the beginning. But the noticing had a different quality, not the careful watchfulness of a woman mapping unfamiliar territory, but the easy attention of a woman who knows where she is and is glad to be there. She rode through the gate. She rode up toward the house that had been empty and was now full, toward the rooms that had been locked and were now open, toward the life she had walked into without knowing what it would become, and she felt the particular, incandescent warmth of a thing that had been built carefully from small true pieces and had turned out, in the end, to be something that would hold. A woman who had walked down an aisle invisible had built a marriage, a household, a partnership, and a case in a circuit courtroom, not because anyone had rescued her, not because anyone had handed her the means to do it, but because she had paid attention and told the truth and refused to leave. And the man who had once refused to look at his bride now watched her ride up the drive with the expression of someone who has understood, at some cost and with some delay, that the most significant thing he had ever almost missed was the person arriving. He had turned around, finally, completely, without reservation, and he was never going to look away again.